The great hall of Ashworth Castle blazed with the light of 1,000 candles on that cold December night in the year of our Lord 1412. Flames danced upon golden chandeliers, casting trembling shadows across ancient tapestries that depicted hunts and battles long since passed into legend. The winter feast had drawn nobility from every corner of the kingdom. Lords and ladies draped in velvet and silk, their fingers heavy with rings, their necks adorned with jewels that caught the firelight and scattered it like fallen stars across the stone walls. Lady Eleanor Blackwood, Baroness of Ashworth, presided over the gathering from her seat at the high table. She was 28 years of age, a widow whose husband had perished 2 winters past in a hunting accident that some whispered was not entirely accidental. Since his death, she had governed these lands with absolute authority, her beauty as legendary as her cruelty, her wit as sharp as the daggers that hung in the armory below. Tonight she wore black velvet trimmed with silver thread, the color of mourning, the color of power, the color that made her pale skin glow like moonlight and her gray eyes shine like polished steel. Around her, the nobility feasted upon roasted venison and honeyed ham, their goblets overflowing with spiced wine that had been warming by the fire since morning. Minstrels played in the gallery above, their melodies weaving through laughter and conversation. Lords discussed politics and hunting, ladies whispered of marriages and scandals. Servants moved silently between the tables, refilling cups and clearing plates with the practiced invisibility of those who had learned that being noticed meant being punished. It was then that the accident happened. A young servant carrying a heavy pitcher of wine stumbled on the uneven rushes that covered the floor. The pitcher flew from his hands, its contents arcing through the air in a crimson wave that splashed across the white tablecloth before Lady Eleanor and across the sleeve of her black velvet gown. The hall fell silent. Every voice died. Every movement ceased. Even the minstrels stopped playing, their instruments frozen in their hands. All eyes turned to the young man who now knelt on the floor, his face white as snow, his body trembling as he realized the magnitude of what he had done. He was perhaps 20 years of age, with dark hair that fell across his forehead in unruly waves and eyes the color of summer leaves. His clothes marked him as one of the lowest servants, rough wool and patched leather, the garb of those who worked the gardens and stables. Yet even in his terror, there was something about him that did not quite fit his station. A straightness of spine, a dignity that poverty could not entirely erase. His name was Thomas Ashford, and he had been working in the gardens of Ashworth Castle for 3 years, invisible and forgotten, just another pair of hands to tend the roses and pull the weeds, until now. Lady Eleanor rose slowly from her chair. The wine dripped from her sleeve onto the floor, each drop falling in the terrible silence like the tolling of a funeral bell. Her face was calm, too calm, her expression the mask of someone who has learned to hide rage behind a wall of ice. "You," she said, her voice soft and deadly. "Come here." Thomas rose on shaking legs. He approached the high table, his eyes fixed on the floor, his breath coming in short, terrified gasps. When he reached Lady Eleanor, he fell to his knees again, his forehead nearly touching the wine-stained rushes. "Forgive me, my lady," he whispered. "I stumbled. I did not mean—" "Silence." The word cut through the air like a blade. Thomas's mouth snapped shut. Lady Eleanor circled him slowly, her ruined gown trailing behind her. The assembled nobility watched with expressions ranging from amusement to anticipation. They knew Eleanor's temper. They had seen her punish servants for lesser offenses. Some leaned forward in their seats, eager to witness whatever entertainment was about to unfold. "What is your name?" Eleanor asked. "Thomas, my lady. Thomas Ashford." "Thomas Ashford." She repeated the name as if tasting something bitter. "And what is your position in my household, Thomas Ashford?" "I tend the gardens, my lady. The roses and—" "A gardener." Eleanor's laugh was bright and brittle, designed to wound. She turned to her guests, spreading her arms wide. "Do you hear that, my lords and ladies? A gardener, a creature who plays in the dirt, has ruined a gown worth more than his entire miserable life." Laughter rippled through the crowd, cruel, eager laughter. Thomas's hands clenched at his sides, but he remained silent, his head bowed. "Look at me," Eleanor commanded. He raised his eyes. In that moment, as their gazes met, something passed between them. A flash of recognition, of challenge, of some emotion neither could name. Thomas's green eyes held no servility, no fear. They held instead a quiet fire, a dignity that her mockery could not extinguish. It infuriated her. "You think yourself proud, don't you?" Eleanor stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the earth on his skin, the green scent of growing things. "You think that because you can coax flowers from the ground, you are somehow worthy of respect. But let me tell you what you are, gardener. You are nothing. You are dirt. You are less than the mud I scrape from my boots." She reached out and cupped his chin in her hand, forcing his face upward. "And tonight, you will learn your place." She released him and stepped back. When she spoke again, her voice carried across the hall with cold authority. "This creature has offended me. He has ruined my gown and disrupted my feast. Therefore, he shall provide us with entertainment to compensate for his clumsiness." She smiled, and there was no warmth in it. "He shall crawl from here to the doors of the great hall, on his hands and knees, like the animal he is. And as he crawls, he shall recite the words I give him, loudly, so all may hear." The nobility exchanged glances of delighted anticipation. Some laughed, some whispered behind their hands. A few, a very few, looked away, unable to witness what was about to happen. "These are the words you will say," Eleanor continued, her eyes never leaving Thomas's face. "I am nothing. I am dirt. I am unworthy to breathe the same air as my betters. I beg forgiveness for my existence." Thomas did not move. For a long, terrible moment, it seemed he might refuse. The defiance in his eyes burned brighter, and Eleanor felt something stir in her chest. Something that might have been respect, or might have been fear. Then slowly, he lowered himself to the ground. "I am nothing," he said, his voice steady as he began to crawl. "I am dirt. I am unworthy to breathe the same air as my betters." Step by step, word by word, he made his way across the great hall, his dignity stripped away with each movement, his humanity reduced to entertainment for those who had never known a day of labor in their lives. "I beg forgiveness for my existence." The words echoed off the stone walls. The nobility laughed and pointed. Some threw scraps of food at him as he passed. Others lifted their feet from the rushes, forcing him to crawl around them, extending his humiliation. And through it all, Eleanor watched from the high table, her face a mask of triumph. But deep in her chest, in the place where her heart should have been, something twisted. Something that felt almost like shame. She ignored it. When Thomas finally reached the doors of the great hall, he rose to his feet. He did not turn around. He simply pushed open the heavy oak doors and walked out into the cold December night, his head held high despite everything. The doors closed behind him. The music resumed. The conversation returned. The feast continued as if nothing had happened. But in the shadows near the servants' entrance, an old man stood watching. His name was Brother William, and he had served as chaplain to Ashworth Castle for 40 years. He had baptized Eleanor as an infant. He had buried her father and her husband. He had witnessed more sin within these walls than he cared to remember, and he knew something that no one else in that hall knew. He knew who Thomas Ashford truly was. The gardens of Ashworth Castle lay silent under a blanket of snow. Winter had stripped the roses of their glory, leaving only thorns and bare branches that reached toward the gray sky like the fingers of supplicants praying for warmth. The fountains had been stilled, their waters frozen into sculptures of ice. The paths that had once invited leisurely strolls now lay hidden beneath drifts that reached past a man's knees. It was here, in the cold light of dawn, that Thomas Ashford came to find solace. He sat on a stone bench at the heart of the rose garden, heedless of the cold that seeped through his thin clothes. His hands hung between his knees, his breath misted in the air. The words he had been forced to speak still echoed in his mind, each one a wound that would not heal. "I am nothing. I am dirt. I beg forgiveness for my existence. He had said those words. He had crawled on his hands and knees before 100 laughing nobles. He had endured the greatest humiliation of his life at the hands of a woman who saw him as less than human. And he had done it because he had no choice. Because to refuse would have meant death, or worse, the loss of the position that allowed him to stay close to Ashworth Castle, close to the truth that he had been seeking for 15 years. You handled that with remarkable grace, a voice said behind him. Thomas did not turn. He had known Brother William was there. The old man's footsteps were distinctive, slow and shuffling, accompanied by the wheeze of lungs that had breathed too much cold air over too many winters. Grace, Thomas repeated bitterly. Is that what you call it? I call it patience. Brother William lowered himself onto the bench beside Thomas, his old bones creaking in protest. Your father had the same quality, the ability to endure injustice without losing himself to rage. My father's patience got him killed. Your father's patience kept you alive. The chaplain's voice was gentle but firm. If he had fought, if he had resisted, they would have killed you too. You were only 7 years old, Thomas, a child. He chose to die so that you might live. Thomas closed his eyes. He could still remember that night 15 years ago when the soldiers had come for his father. Sir Richard Ashford, Lord of Thornhaven, accused of treason against the crown. Thomas had hidden in a cupboard, watching through a crack as they dragged his father away in chains. He had seen his mother collapse, screaming. He had heard his father's last words to her, "Keep him safe. Whatever happens, keep him safe." 3 days later, his mother was dead. A fever, they said. But Thomas knew the truth. She had died of a broken heart, unable to survive in a world where her husband had been taken from her. And Thomas had been cast out, his father's lands seized, his family's name erased from history. He had grown up in the shadows, passed from one reluctant relative to another until he was old enough to work. And then he had come here, to Ashworth Castle, because Brother William had sent for him, because Brother William knew the truth. I have waited 15 years, Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. 15 years of servitude. 15 years of bowing and scraping and pretending to be nothing. When does it end? When do I get to reclaim what was stolen from my family? When the time is right. The time is never right. Thomas surged to his feet, unable to contain his frustration any longer. Every day I walk through these halls and see the wealth that was built on my father's corpse. Every day, I tend gardens that should be mine. And every night, I lie in a servant's cot and dream of a life that was stolen from me before I was old enough to understand what I had lost. Brother William waited until Thomas's outburst had subsided. Then he spoke, his voice calm and measured. Your father was betrayed by men who wanted his lands and his influence. They forged evidence. They bribed witnesses. They convinced the king that Sir Richard Ashford was a traitor. And the king, believing those lies, ordered his execution. I know all this. What you do not know is that I have spent the past 15 years gathering evidence of his innocence. Brother William reached into his robes and withdrew a small leather pouch. Letters, documents, testimony from witnesses who were afraid to speak at the time, but whose consciences have troubled them ever since. Thomas turned to look at the old man, hope and disbelief warring on his face. This evidence is almost complete, Brother William continued, but it is not enough. To restore your family's name, to reclaim your lands and titles, you need something more. You need a champion, someone with power, someone with influence, someone who can present your case to the king and demand justice. And where am I supposed to find such a champion? Who would risk their position, their wealth, their very life, to help a disgraced gardener reclaim his birthright? Brother William smiled sadly. That, my son, is a question only time can answer. But I believe, I have always believed, that God does not abandon the righteous. Your moment will come. You must only have faith. Thomas looked out across the frozen gardens. The rose bushes stood bare and dormant, waiting for spring. waiting for the warmth that would bring them back to life. Patience, he thought. Always patience. But patience was so very hard. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Stories like this one reveal the depths of human resilience and the unexpected turns that change everything. Subscribe now, because the moment that will silence the entire hall is yet to come. The weeks following the banquet were strange ones for Lady Eleanor Blackwood. She found herself unable to forget the gardener. It was absurd, infuriating. She had humiliated dozens of servants in her time. It was her right, her privilege, the natural order of things. They were beneath her, and reminding them of their place was simply part of maintaining proper discipline. She had never given a second thought to any of them afterward. But Thomas Ashford was different. She saw his face in her dreams, not cowering, not weeping, but staring up at her with those green eyes that held no fear. Eyes that seemed to see through her, past the velvet gowns and jeweled rings, past the cold mask she showed the world, to something beneath. Something she had buried so deep she had almost forgotten it existed. She caught herself watching for him from her windows. The gardens lay dormant in winter, but there were still tasks to be done. Clearing snow from the paths, protecting the more delicate plants from frost, preparing the soil for spring. She would stand at the glass for hours, telling herself she was merely observing her lands until she spotted a familiar figure moving among the bare rose bushes, and then she would watch him. She told herself it was anger, resentment that a servant had dared to look at her with such defiance. But anger did not explain the way her heart quickened when she saw him. Anger did not explain the strange hollowness she felt when he disappeared from view. Something was happening to her. Something she did not understand and could not control. It was Margaret, her lady-in-waiting, who finally forced her to confront the truth. Margaret had served the Blackwood family for 30 years. She had been Eleanor's nurse as an infant, her companion as a child, her confidant as a woman. If anyone could speak honestly to the Baroness of Ashworth, it was she. "You are not yourself, my lady," Margaret said one evening, as she brushed Eleanor's dark hair before the fire. "You have been distant, distracted. I cannot remember the last time you smiled." "I have nothing to smile about. That has never stopped you before." Margaret's hands continued their rhythmic motion, gentle and sure. "Something troubles you. Something has changed since the winter feast." Eleanor stared into the flames, watching them dance and flicker. The fire reminded her of the candles in the great hall, the candles that had illuminated her cruelty for all to see. "Do you remember the servant who spilled wine on my gown?" she asked, surprising herself. Margaret's hands paused for just a moment. "The gardener. Yes, I remember. I cannot stop thinking about him." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Margaret resumed brushing, her strokes slower now, more deliberate. "Thinking about him how, my lady?" Eleanor did not answer. She did not know how to answer. How could she explain the tumult of emotions that churned within her? Guilt and curiosity, anger and attraction, the terrible sense that in humiliating Thomas Ashford, she had somehow humiliated herself? "He looked at me," she said finally. "When I forced him to kneel, when I spoke those cruel words, he looked at me. And there was no hatred in his eyes, no fear, just recognition, as if he saw something in me that I had forgotten was there. Perhaps he did." Eleanor turned to face her lady-in-waiting. "What do you mean?" Margaret set down the brush and took Eleanor's hands in her own. Her eyes, faded with age but still sharp with intelligence, held a gentleness that Eleanor had not seen in years. "I have known you since you were born, child. I remember you before your mother died, before your father's cruelty shaped you into the woman you have become. You were kind once, gentle. You would cry when the cook killed a chicken for dinner. You would share your bread with the servants' children. That girl died long ago. Perhaps." Margaret squeezed her hands. "Or perhaps she has only been sleeping, waiting for something or someone to wake her." Eleanor pulled away, rising from her chair to pace before the fire. "You are speaking nonsense," He is a servant, a gardener. I am the Baroness of Ashworth. Whatever foolish thoughts have been plaguing me, they mean nothing. They cannot mean anything. Love does not ask permission, my lady. It does not respect titles or stations. It simply is. Love? Eleanor spun to face Margaret, her voice sharp with denial. I do not love him. I do not even know him. Then perhaps, Margaret said softly, it is time you did. 3 days later, Eleanor did something she had never done in her life. She went to the gardens. It was early morning, the hour just after dawn when the servants were beginning their work and the nobles still slept off the excesses of the previous night. The snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of dark earth beneath. The air smelled of cold and dampness and the first faint promise of spring. She found Thomas in the rose garden, kneeling beside a bush that had been damaged by frost. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, cutting away the dead wood, examining the roots for signs of health. He was so absorbed in his work that he did not hear her approach. Eleanor watched him for a long moment, hidden in the shadow of an ancient yew tree. He looked different out here, away from the great hall and its glittering cruelty. More real, more alive. The morning light caught the strong lines of his face, the careful grace of his movements, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead. He was beautiful, she realized, not in the soft, pampered way of the noble lords who sought her hand, but in a harder, more honest way, the beauty of things that had grown through struggle, that had survived despite everything. You can come out, my lady. I know you are there. His voice startled her. She hesitated, suddenly uncertain, then stepped out from behind the yew tree. Her finest cloak suddenly felt too elaborate, too artificial for this simple setting. How did you know? She asked. Thomas rose to his feet, brushing dirt from his knees. I have spent years learning to notice things others ignore. The shadow beneath the tree was wrong, and... He paused, a ghost of a smile crossing his lips. Your perfume. Roses and lavender. I could smell it from 20 paces away. Eleanor did not know what to say. She, who had always had a cutting remark ready for any situation, found herself speechless before this man she had so thoroughly humiliated. I should apologize, she said finally, for what happened at the feast. Thomas's expression did not change. Should you? Or do you simply feel you ought to want to apologize, which is not the same thing? The accuracy of his observation stung. You presume to know my mind? I presume nothing, my lady. I only observe. He turned back to the rosebush, resuming his work. You came here for a reason. What is it? Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. What was the reason? Why had she come? What did she hope to accomplish by seeking out this servant in her gardens? I do not know, she admitted. I only know that I cannot stop thinking about that night, about the things I said, the things I made you do. She paused, gathering courage. About the way you looked at me. Thomas's hand stilled on the rose bush. For a long moment, he did not speak. When I was a boy, he said quietly, my father taught me that true nobility has nothing to do with titles or lands. It is a quality of the soul, a choice to be honorable, to be kind, to treat others with dignity regardless of their station. He turned to face her, those green eyes holding her gaze with disconcerting intensity. I looked at you that night, Lady Eleanor, and I wondered where your nobility had gone. What had happened to make you so cruel? You know nothing about me. I know that cruelty is often the refuge of those who are afraid. I know that people who hurt others are usually trying to forget their own pain. And I know that somewhere beneath that mask you wear, there is a woman who longs to be something other than what she has become. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them away fiercely. She did not cry. She had not cried since she was 12 years old. How dare you? She whispered, but there was no heat in the words. How dare you speak to me as if you know? You came to me, Thomas interrupted gently. You sought me out. You could have ignored your conscience, forgotten the servant you humiliated, continued with your life as before. But you did not. You are here. And that tells me more about who you truly are than anything you said that night." He reached out, and with infinite care took her hand in his. His fingers were rough with calluses, stained with dirt from the roses. But his touch was gentle, almost reverent. "I do not hate you, Lady Eleanor. I pity you, because I think you have forgotten how to be happy, and that is a tragedy far greater than anything you have done to me." Eleanor stared at their joined hands, his rough and weathered, hers soft and white, two worlds touching. "I do not deserve your pity," she said. "Perhaps not, but you have it nonetheless." He released her hand and stepped back. "Now, if you will excuse me, my lady, I have roses to tend. Unless you wish to help?" The question was so unexpected that Eleanor laughed, a real laugh, the first she had uttered in longer than she could remember. "You want me to help you garden?" "Why not? The earth cares nothing for titles. It receives the touch of baroness and gardener alike." He picked up a small trowel and held it out to her. "Or are you afraid to get your hands dirty?" It was a challenge. She recognized it as such, and somewhere deep within her, that girl who had cried over chickens and shared bread with servants stirred from her long sleep. Eleanor took the trowel. "Show me what to do," she said. And in the winter garden of Ashworth Castle, kneeling in the cold dirt beside the man she had humiliated, Lady Eleanor Blackwood began to discover who she might have been all along. Spring came slowly to Ashworth that year, as if the earth itself was reluctant to release winter's grip. But when it finally arrived, it arrived with vengeance, a riot of color and warmth that transformed the castle grounds into something from a troubadour's song. The roses bloomed earlier than anyone could remember. They burst forth in profusion, climbing walls and cascading over trellises, filling the air with a perfume so intoxicating that even the most hardened soldiers found themselves pausing to breathe it in. Red and white, pink and yellow, even the rare purple variety that had been the pride of Ashworth for generations. They bloomed as if making up for lost time, as if celebrating some secret joy that only they could understand. And in the center of it all, two figures walked together along the garden paths. They had been meeting for months now, always in secret, always in the early hours of morning when the castle still slept. Eleanor had traded her velvet gowns for simpler dresses, her jeweled slippers for sturdy boots that could bear the mud of the garden paths. Her hands, once soft and white, now bore calluses from the trowel and scratches from the thorns. She had never been happier. Thomas taught her about the roses, their varieties, their needs, the careful art of pruning and grafting that could create new colors from old stock. He taught her about patience, about the slow miracle of watching a seed become a flower, about the satisfaction of nurturing life from the earth. And in teaching her these things, he taught her something else, something she had not expected. He taught her about herself. "You are not who you pretend to be," he told her one morning as they walked together through the awakening garden. "The cruel Baroness, the heartless widow, it is a mask, a performance. Beneath it, you are someone entirely different. And who am I, according to you? You are someone who has been hurt, someone who learned early that the world is a dangerous place and that the only way to survive is to strike first. Someone who has spent so long pretending to be strong that she has forgotten what it feels like to be vulnerable." Eleanor stopped walking. They had reached the center of the rose garden, where a marble fountain stood dormant, waiting for the weather to warm enough for its waters to flow again. "You speak as if you know me better than I know myself." "Perhaps I do." Thomas turned to face her, his green eyes soft in the morning light. "Or perhaps I simply recognize a kindred spirit. Someone who has lost everything and had to rebuild themselves from the ruins." "What do you mean?" Thomas was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, heavier, older, carrying the weight of secrets long buried. "I am not who I pretend to be either, Eleanor." It was the first time he had used her name without her title. The intimacy of it sent a shiver down her spine. "My lady, no. You have started this. You will finish it." She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the pulse beating in his throat. "Who are you, Thomas Ashford? Tell me the truth." And so he told her. He told her about his father, Sir Richard Ashford, Lord of Thornhaven, one of the most respected knights in the kingdom. He told her about the false accusations of treason, the forged evidence, the trial that was a mockery of justice. He told her about the execution and his mother's death, and the years of exile and poverty that followed. He told her about Brother William, who had served as chaplain to the Ashford family before coming to Ashworth, and who had brought Thomas here to hide in plain sight while he gathered evidence of Sir Richard's innocence. And he told her about the men who had destroyed his family, the nobles who had coveted his father's lands, who had bribed witnesses and falsified documents, who had murdered an innocent man to satisfy their greed. One of those men had been Eleanor's grandfather. When he finished speaking, Eleanor stood frozen, her face pale as winter snow. The roses bloomed around them, indifferent to the revelation that had just shattered everything she thought she knew about her family, her history, herself. "My grandfather," she whispered. "He was part of this?" "He was the architect of it. The letters that condemned my father were written in his hand. The witnesses who testified against him were paid with his gold." Thomas's voice was steady, but his hands had clenched into fists at his sides. "Your family's wealth, Lady Eleanor, the castle you live in, the lands you govern, the power you wield, all of it was built on my father's corpse." Eleanor felt the world spin around her. She reached out blindly for support and found Thomas's arm beneath her hand. "I came here for revenge," he continued, his voice softer now, almost gentle. "I wanted to find proof of what your grandfather had done. I wanted to expose your family, to reclaim my birthright, to see justice done at last. And now?" Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something that made her heart ache. "Now I find myself in love with the granddaughter of the man who destroyed my family, and I do not know what to do with that." The words hung between them, fragile as rose petals, dangerous as thorns. "You love me?" Eleanor's voice cracked on the words. "God help me, I do." Thomas raised his hand and touched her cheek, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I have tried not to. I have told myself 1,000 times that you are my enemy, that your blood is tainted with the sins of your grandfather, that to love you would be to betray my father's memory. But the heart does not listen to reason. The heart wants what it wants." Eleanor closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. She could feel tears sliding down her cheeks. The tears she had forbidden herself for 16 years, finally breaking free. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have loved you since the day you looked at me in the great hall and saw the woman beneath the mask. I have loved you since you put a trowel in my hand and taught me that there was more to life than power and cruelty. I have loved you, and I have been terrified of that love, because I knew that it could destroy us both." Thomas pulled her into his arms. She went willingly, burying her face against his chest, breathing in the scent of earth and roses that clung to him always. "What do we do now?" she asked. "I do not know." He pressed his lips to her hair, holding her close. "I only know that I cannot give you up. Whatever else happens, whatever justice demands, I cannot lose you." They stood there in the rose garden, two people from enemy houses, holding each other as if the world outside did not exist, and perhaps in that moment it did not. Perhaps there was only the warmth of the spring sun, the perfume of the flowers, and the impossible, undeniable truth of love, but the world would not be ignored forever. If this story has touched your heart, if you see yourself in Eleanor's awakening or Thomas's resilience, leave a comment below saying, "Love finds us in the most unexpected places." Your words remind us all that every story matters. The summer that followed was the happiest of Eleanor's life. She and Thomas continued to meet in secret, stealing hours together in the gardens, in the forgotten corners of the castle, in the ruins of an old chapel that stood in the forest beyond the walls. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. They planned a future that seemed impossible, but which they could not stop imagining. And they fell deeper in love with every passing day. But secrets, like roses, cannot bloom in darkness forever. Eventually, they must see the light. It was Margaret who discovered the truth. She had grown suspicious of Eleanor's morning disappearances, her distracted smiles, the dirt that sometimes lingered beneath her fingernails despite the lady's maid's best efforts. One dawn, she followed her mistress to the gardens and watched from behind a hedge as Eleanor embraced the young gardener with a passion that left no room for doubt. Margaret did not confront Eleanor immediately. Instead, she waited, watching, gathering information. And what she learned terrified her. She learned about Thomas's true identity. She learned about the evidence Brother William had been gathering. She learned that the foundations of the Blackwood fortune were built on lies and murder. And she knew, with the certainty of one who has spent a lifetime at court, that if this information became public, it would destroy Eleanor. But Margaret's loyalty was not to truth. It was to her mistress, or rather to her mistress's position and the power that came with it. She had spent 30 years in the shadow of the Blackwoods, enjoying privileges that servants in other houses could only dream of. She would not see that comfort threatened by a dead man's son and a lovesick Baroness. She went to Lord Harrington. Lord Harrington was Eleanor's nearest neighbor and longtime rival. He had coveted Ashworth lands for years, proposing marriage to Eleanor 3 times since her husband's death and being refused each time with increasing coldness. He was a man of ambition and flexible morality, exactly the sort who would find value in the information Margaret had to sell. The bargain was struck in a candlelit room in Harrington Castle, with wine and whispered promises. Margaret would provide evidence of Eleanor's affair with the gardener. She would reveal Thomas's identity and the threat he posed to the established order. And in exchange, when the scandal destroyed Eleanor and her lands were seized, Margaret would receive a comfortable pension and a cottage of her own. Lord Harrington smiled as he sealed the agreement. This was better than marriage. This was power without the inconvenience of a wife. He began to make plans. The invitation arrived at Ashworth Castle on the first day of August. It was written on fine vellum, sealed with Lord Harrington's wolf sigil, addressed to Lady Eleanor Blackwood in flowing script. The contents were simple enough. Lord Harrington was hosting a grand banquet to celebrate the king's birthday, and he requested the honor of the Baroness of Ashworth's presence. Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse. Relations with Harrington had been cold for years, and she had no desire to spend an evening making polite conversation with a man who looked at her like a wolf eyeing a lamb. But Margaret counseled acceptance. "It would be seen as an insult to refuse, my lady," she said, her face arranged in an expression of innocent concern. "Lord Harrington has invited every noble house in the region. Your absence would be noted, commented upon. There are already whispers about your eccentricities." "What whispers?" "Your morning walks, your preference for solitude. Some say you have gone mad with grief for your husband. Others suggest—" Margaret paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "Others suggest what?" "Nothing, my lady, merely foolish gossip. But it would be wise to appear in public, to remind the world that the Baroness of Ashworth is still the powerful, respected figure she has always been." Eleanor considered. She did not trust Margaret, had never entirely trusted her. But the logic was sound. She had been neglecting her social obligations. A public appearance would silence the gossips and reinforce her position. "Very well," she said. "I will attend." Margaret bowed, hiding the smile that threatened to break across her face. "I shall begin preparations immediately, my lady." Thomas learned of the invitation that evening, when Eleanor came to meet him in their usual place, a grove of apple trees at the far edge of the gardens, where the walls were low and the shadows deep. "You cannot go," he said, his face grave. "It is too dangerous." "Dangerous how? It is only a banquet." "Nothing involving Lord Harrington is only anything. The man has been seeking your downfall for years. Why would he suddenly invite you to his home as an honored guest? Perhaps he has accepted that I will never marry him. Perhaps he wishes to mend fences." Thomas shook his head. "I do not trust it. Something is wrong. I can feel it." Eleanor took his hands in hers, looking up into his worried face. You see plots everywhere, my love. It is understandable, given what you have been through. But not every invitation is a trap. Not every smile hides a knife. The smiles that hide knives are the ones that look most genuine. Thomas pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her. Let me come with you. I can travel as a servant, part of your retinue. I can watch for danger. And be recognized? There will be nobles at this banquet who knew your father, who might see his face in yours. Eleanor shook her head. No, it is too great a risk. I will go. I will smile. I will make polite conversation, and I will return safely. You will see. Thomas was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with foreboding. I have a bad feeling about this, Eleanor. Promise me you will be careful. I promise. She rose on her toes and kissed him softly. Nothing will happen, and when I return, we will talk about the future. Our future. She left him standing in the grove as darkness fell, his eyes following her until she disappeared into the shadows. If she had turned, she might have seen the anguish on his face. If she had listened more carefully, she might have heard the rustle of movement in the bushes nearby, Margaret retreating to report to her new master. But she did neither. And so the trap was set. Harrington Castle blazed with light on the night of the king's birthday celebration. Every window glowed with the light of countless candles. Torches lined the road leading to the gates, their flames dancing in the summer breeze. Carriages streamed through the entrance in an endless procession, depositing nobles in their finest attire, each one eager to see and be seen at the most anticipated event of the social season. Eleanor arrived at sunset, her carriage bearing the Blackwood arms, her gown a masterpiece of deep red silk embroidered with golden thread. She had dressed to make a statement, to remind everyone present that the Baroness of Ashworth bowed to no one. But as she descended from the carriage and looked up at the blazing castle, she felt the first flutter of unease. Something was wrong. She could not say what it was. The evening was perfect, warm and clear, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of summer flowers. The guests streaming into the castle seemed cheerful and eager. The music floating from within was lively and welcoming. And yet, Eleanor pushed aside her doubts and entered the castle. She was greeted by servants who led her through gilded corridors to the great hall, where Lord Harrington waited to receive his guests. Lady Blackwood. His smile was wide, his bow deep. What a pleasure. What an honor. I had begun to fear you might not come. I would not miss such a magnificent celebration, Eleanor replied, her own smile fixed firmly in place. You have outdone yourself, my lord. Nothing but the best for our beloved king. Harrington took her arm, guiding her into the hall. Come, let me introduce you to some of our other guests. Many have been eager to make your acquaintance. The next few hours passed in a blur of conversation and wine, of smiles and pleasantries exchanged with lords and ladies whose names Eleanor forgot as soon as she heard them. She danced with young knights who trod on her feet and old lords who smelled of decay. She listened to gossip about people she had never met and scandal she did not care about. And all the while, she felt eyes upon her, watching, waiting. It was near midnight when Lord Harrington called for silence. He stood at the high table, his goblet raised, his face flushed with wine and excitement. The musicians fell silent. The conversations died. Every eye in the hall turned toward him. My lords and ladies, his voice echoed off the stone walls. I thank you for joining me this evening to celebrate our glorious king. It is a night for joy, for celebration, for the bonds of friendship that unite us all. Applause rippled through the crowd. But I have another reason for gathering you here tonight. Harrington's smile widened, and there was something in it that made Eleanor's blood run cold. A reason that concerns a matter of justice, of truth, of honor. He turned, and his eyes found Eleanor where she stood near the edge of the crowd. Lady Eleanor Blackwood, please join me. The crowd parted before her. Eleanor walked forward, her head held high, her face betraying nothing of the terror that had begun to claw at her chest. She climbed the steps to the high table and stood beside Harrington, looking out at the sea of curious faces below. "Lady Eleanor," Harrington said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "I am afraid I have disturbing news that pains me greatly to share. But share it I must for the sake of justice." "What news, my lord?" Eleanor's voice was steady, but her heart was pounding. "It has come to my attention that you have been involved with a servant in your household, a gardener, I believe, a young man named Thomas." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "Furthermore," Harrington continued, his voice rising with theatrical outrage, "I have learned that this servant is not what he seems. He is, in fact, the son of Sir Richard Ashford, a convicted traitor who was executed for crimes against the crown 15 years ago." The gasps turned to shouts of shock and anger. Eleanor could hear voices rising, demanding explanations, calling for guards. The world seemed to spin around her. "But that is not all." Harrington's voice cut through the chaos. "I have evidence, undeniable evidence, that this Thomas Ashford has been plotting to overthrow Lady Eleanor, to seize control of Ashworth, and to use that position to enact revenge upon all those who participated in his father's just punishment." He turned to Eleanor, his eyes glittering with triumph. "Including your own grandfather, my lady, who, I believe, was instrumental in bringing Sir Richard to justice." Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, to deny, to explain, but no words came. The trap had been sprung, and there was no escape. "I have informed the King's Guard," Harrington said, addressing the crowd once more. "They are on their way to Ashworth Castle as we speak, to arrest Thomas Ashford and anyone who has aided him in his treasonous plot, including, I am sorry to say, Lady Eleanor herself." "This is madness!" Eleanor finally found her voice, but it was swallowed by the roar of the crowd. "I have committed no treason. Thomas has done nothing wrong." "So says the woman who shares his bed." Harrington's voice dripped with contempt. "You have been seduced by the son of a traitor, Lady Eleanor. You have betrayed your family, your king, and your honor, and for that you will answer to justice." Guards emerged from the shadows, moving toward Eleanor. She backed away, but there was nowhere to go. She was surrounded. "Take her to the dungeon," Harrington commanded. "She will await the king's judgment there." Hands seized her arms. She struggled, but it was useless against the strength of armored men. She was dragged down from the high table, through the gaping crowd, toward a door that led to the darkness below. "Thomas!" she screamed. "Thomas!" But Thomas was miles away, in the gardens of Ashworth Castle, unaware that the woman he loved was being torn from the world they had built together, unaware that his enemies had finally found him. The news reached Ashworth Castle at dawn. Brother William brought it himself, riding through the night on a horse borrowed from a sympathetic farmer. He found Thomas in the gardens, as always, tending the roses that had become his solace and his sanctuary. "They have taken her," the old chaplain gasped, nearly collapsing from the saddle. "Harrington has accused her of treason. She is imprisoned in his dungeon." Thomas caught the old man before he could fall, lowering him gently to a stone bench. His face had gone pale as death, but his voice, when he spoke, was steady. "Tell me everything," Brother William told him. The banquet, the accusation, the guards who had been sent to arrest him, the trap that had been laid so carefully and sprung so perfectly. "They know who you are," Brother William concluded. "They know about your father, about the evidence we have gathered, about everything. Someone betrayed you, Thomas. Someone close to Eleanor." Thomas's mind raced through possibilities, landing at last on the only answer that made sense. Margaret. It had to be Margaret. What do we do? The King's Guards will be here soon. We must flee. No. The word was spoken with absolute finality. Thomas straightened, and something in his posture changed. The gardener fell away, and in his place stood something different. Something older. Something that had been waiting, all these years, for this moment. "I am done running," he said. "I am done hiding. My father was innocent, and I have the proof. It is time the world learned the truth. The world will not listen to a gardener. Then I will not speak as a gardener. Thomas turned to face Brother William, his green eyes blazing with determination. Where is the evidence? All of it? Hidden, in the chapel ruins. Then we must retrieve it, and we must move quickly. Thomas began to walk toward the castle, his stride purposeful. Tonight, Harrington hosts a second banquet, a celebration of his triumph over the Blackwoods. Every noble in the region will be there to witness Eleanor's humiliation. You cannot mean to go there. It is suicide. Thomas stopped and looked back at the old chaplain. A strange smile played at the corners of his mouth. My father was a knight, he said. One of the finest in the kingdom. He taught me everything he knew. How to ride, how to fight, how to carry myself as a man of honor. Do you know what else he taught me, Brother William? The chaplain shook his head. He taught me that a true knight never abandons the innocent to suffer, never allows injustice to stand unchallenged, never surrenders hope, even in the darkest hour. Thomas turned and continued walking, his voice carrying back over his shoulder. Tonight, I ride to Harrington Castle. Tonight, I claim my birthright. And tonight, I will bring Eleanor home, or die trying. The white horse was named Frost. He had belonged to a knight who had died 3 years past, a friend of Brother William who had left instructions that the horse be cared for until it was needed. It was a magnificent animal, strong and swift, with a coat that gleamed like fresh snow and eyes that held a fierce intelligence. Thomas had ridden him in secret, late at night when the world was asleep. He had trained with sword and lance in the ruins of the old chapel, honing skills that had lain dormant since childhood. He had prepared for a moment like this, even though he had not known what form it would take. Now, as the sun began to set, he stood in the stable of Ashworth Castle, armoring himself in steel that Brother William had preserved from his father's collection. The armor was old but well-maintained, polished to a mirror shine. It bore no device, no identifying mark, only the simple lines of a knight prepared for battle. You will need proof, Brother William said, handing Thomas a leather satchel. Inside are the letters, your father's correspondence with Lord Blackwood, proving that he knew of the conspiracy and chose to participate. There are also statements from witnesses, documents showing the forgeries, everything we have gathered over 15 years. Thomas took the satchel and secured it to Frost's saddle. If I do not return, you will return. But if I do not, promise me that this evidence will reach the king. Promise me that my father's name will be cleared, even if I am not there to see it. Brother William's eyes glistened with tears, but his voice was firm. I promise. Thomas mounted Frost, settling into the saddle with the easy grace of one born to ride. The white horse danced beneath him, sensing his rider's tension, eager for action. Thank you, Thomas said, for everything. For saving me when I was a boy, for giving me purpose, for believing that justice was possible. Thank me by returning alive. Thank me by claiming the future you deserve. Brother William raised his hand in blessing. Go with God, Thomas Ashford, and may your father's spirit ride beside you. Thomas nodded once, then spurred Frost forward. Horse and rider burst from the stable, galloping through the castle gates and onto the road that led to Harrington Castle. Behind them, the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. And somewhere in the dungeon of Harrington Castle, Eleanor lifted her head at a sound only she could hear. The pounding of hooves on distant roads, the thunder of hope riding toward her through the gathering darkness. Harrington Castle blazed with light for the second night in a row. Lord Harrington had spared no expense for this celebration. The victory over the Blackwoods was greater than he had ever imagined. Not only had he destroyed his rival, but he had also exposed a traitor's son and positioned himself as a hero of the realm. By morning, he would be the most celebrated man in the kingdom. By week's end, he would be petitioning the king for Eleanor's lands. The great hall was packed with nobles, all eager to witness the culmination of the scandal that had set the region ablaze with gossip. At the high table, Lord Harrington presided over the festivities, his face flushed with wine and triumph. Below, the guests feasted and danced, their laughter ringing off the stone walls. And in the dungeon below, Eleanor waited in darkness, her wrists chained, her spirit unbroken. She had not slept. She had not eaten. She had only sat in silence, thinking of Thomas, praying that he had escaped, hoping that somewhere beyond these cold stone walls, he was safe. She did not expect rescue. She had accepted her fate. But she would not give Harrington the satisfaction of seeing her broken. She would go to her execution, if execution was to be her end. With her head held high and her heart full of the love she had finally learned to feel. The door to her cell scraped open, and torchlight flooded the darkness. It is time. A guard stood in the doorway, his face impassive. Lord Harrington wishes you to be brought to the great hall. He says you should witness his triumph. Eleanor rose, her chains rattling. Then let us not keep him waiting. She was led through corridors that seemed to go on forever, upstairs that wound through the heart of the castle, until finally she emerged into the great hall. The noise hit her like a physical force. Music and laughter, the clatter of plates and the murmur of 100 conversations. It all stopped when she appeared. The music died. The laughter ceased. Every eye in the hall turned toward the disheveled woman in chains who was being led toward the high table like a prisoner to the gallows. Lord Harrington stood, his goblet raised, his smile widening. "Ah, Lady Eleanor, how good of you to join us." He spread his arms wide, gesturing to the crowd. "My lords and ladies, I give you the former Baroness of Ashworth, traitor, seductress, and consort of a condemned man's son." The crowd jeered. Some threw food. Others called out insults that made Eleanor's cheeks burn despite her determination to show no emotion. She was forced to her knees before the high table, her head bowed, her chains pooling on the floor around her. "Have you anything to say before judgment is passed?" Harrington asked, his voice dripping with mockery. "Any defense to offer? Any plea for mercy?" Eleanor raised her head and looked directly into his eyes. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong. "I have nothing to say to you. You are a coward and a schemer, and history will remember you as such. Whatever you do to me, whatever lies you spread, the truth will eventually emerge. And when it does, your name will be cursed by all who value honor and justice." Harrington's smile faltered, but only for a moment. Bold words from a woman in chains. But words will not save you, Lady Eleanor. Nothing will save you now. He raised his goblet, preparing to pronounce sentence, and then the doors of the great hall exploded inward. The white horse came through the doors like a bolt of lightning, its hooves striking sparks from the stone floor. Upon its back sat a knight in gleaming armor, his visor closed, his lance leveled at the high table. Screams erupted. Nobles scrambled to get out of the way. Tables were overturned, food and wine scattered across the floor. The guards reached for their weapons, but the knight was too fast, too precise, his horse carrying him through the chaos like water flowing around stones. He reached the center of the hall and brought his mount to a halt in a single, perfect movement. The white horse reared, its hooves pawing the air, and the knight sat tall in the saddle, every line of his body speaking of power and purpose. The hall fell silent. It was the silence of shock, the silence of disbelief. The silence that falls when the impossible becomes real and the world holds its breath to see what happens next. Lord Harrington had risen from his chair, his face pale, his goblet forgotten in his hand. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "How dare you?" The knight raised his hands to his helmet. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted it from his head and let it fall to the floor. Dark hair, matted with sweat. Green eyes, blazing with righteous fury. A face that some in the crowd recognized immediately. Older now, harder, but unmistakably bearing the features of a family that had once stood among the highest in the realm. "My name," Thomas said, his voice ringing through the silent hall, "is Thomas Ashford, son of Sir Richard Ashford, Lord of Thornhaven, and I have come to claim what is mine." The silence deepened. It seemed to pulse with energy, with the weight of history, with the unspoken knowledge that everything was about to change. Eleanor, still kneeling on the floor, looked up at Thomas through tear-blurred eyes. He was magnificent. He was terrible. He was the man she loved, and he had come for her. "This is absurd!" Lord Harrington found his voice at last. "Guards! Seize this man! He is the son of a traitor!" The guards moved forward, but Thomas raised his hand. "Before you act, hear me out. I have evidence, undeniable evidence, that my father was innocent of the charges against him. Letters proving that the accusations were fabricated, statements from witnesses who were bribed to lie, documents showing that the conspiracy was not my father's, but the conspiracy against him." He reached into the satchel at his side and withdrew a sheaf of papers, holding them high for all to see. These papers prove that Sir Richard Ashford was murdered for his lands and his influence. They prove that the men who orchestrated his death, including Lord Harrington's father, were the true traitors. And they prove that Lady Eleanor Blackwood has committed no crime except falling in love with a man whose only guilt was surviving the destruction of his family. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some voices were skeptical, but others were curious. The nobility loved nothing more than scandal, and this was shaping up to be the scandal of the century. "Lies!" Harrington shouted, his face now crimson with rage. "All lies! This man is a criminal, a deceiver!" "Then let the evidence speak for itself." Thomas's voice was calm, controlled. "Let an impartial judge examine these documents. Let the truth be known, whatever it may be." He looked around the hall, meeting the eyes of lords and ladies who had once been friends of his father. "Unless you are afraid of what the truth might reveal, Lord Harrington." The silence that followed was answer enough. Thomas dismounted from his horse and walked to where Eleanor knelt in chains. He drew a knife from his belt and cut her bonds with a single swift motion. Then he took her hands in his and raised her to her feet. "Are you hurt?" he asked softly. "Not anymore." Eleanor's voice trembled with emotion. "You came for me. I will always come for you." He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I love you, Eleanor Blackwood. I have loved you since the day you knelt beside me in the mud and learned to tend roses, and I will love you until the day I die." The crowd watched in stunned silence as the gardener and the Baroness stood together in the center of the great hall, their hands intertwined, their hearts beating as one. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, a voice began to call, "Ashford! Ashford!" Others joined in. First a few, then dozens, then hundreds. "Ashford! Ashford! Ashford!" The chant filled the great hall, echoing off the stone walls, drowning out Harrington's protests. It was the voice of justice, long delayed, but finally awakened. It was the cry of truth, breaking free from the chains of lies and deception. And in that moment, as the world seemed to shift beneath their feet, Thomas Ashford and Eleanor Blackwood knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The investigation that followed the events at Harrington Castle lasted 3 months. The king himself appointed a council of judges to examine the evidence Thomas had presented. They combed through letters and documents, interviewed witnesses, and compared handwriting samples. They traced the flow of gold that had bribed false witnesses. They uncovered the web of lies that had sent an innocent man to his death. In the end, the verdict was unanimous. Sir Richard Ashford was declared innocent of all charges, his name cleared, his honor restored. The lands that had been stolen from his family were ordered returned to his son. Lord Harrington, faced with overwhelming evidence of his father's crimes and his own complicity in the plot against Eleanor, was stripped of his titles and banished from the kingdom. Thomas Ashford was recognized as the rightful lord of Thornhaven, but he did not forget where he had come from. He did not forget the years of poverty and servitude, the lessons learned in gardens and stables, the wisdom gained through patience and suffering. When he took possession of his ancestral lands, he did so not as a conquering lord, but as a man who understood what it meant to have nothing. He established schools for peasant children. He created workshops where craftsmen could learn their trades. He opened his doors to the poor and the forgotten, proving that true nobility was not a matter of birth, but of character. And through it all, Eleanor was at his side. Their wedding took place on a golden autumn morning in the chapel of Thornhaven Castle, the ancestral home of the Ashfords that had been returned to them at last. The roses that Thomas had tended at Ashworth had been transplanted to the gardens here, and they bloomed in profusion despite the season. Red and white, pink and yellow, even the rare purple variety that seemed to symbolize the impossible love that had brought them together. Brother William performed the ceremony, his voice cracking with emotion as he spoke the words that had been denied to Thomas's parents, who had never lived to see this day. When it was over, when vows had been exchanged and rings placed upon fingers, Thomas and Eleanor walked together through the gardens of their new home, hand in hand as husband and wife. "Do you remember," Eleanor said, "the night you rode into Harrington's Banquet on that white horse? The silence that fell when you removed your helmet?" Thomas smiled. "I remember being terrified. I remember thinking that I might die before I could reach you. I remember the sound of your voice when you spoke of love, even knowing it might cost you everything. And now? Now I know that fear is not the enemy. It is simply the darkness that exists before the dawn. You taught me that, Eleanor. You taught me that love is worth any risk, any sacrifice, any price." They stopped beside a fountain that had been commissioned in memory of Thomas's parents. The water sang its gentle song, catching the autumn sunlight like scattered diamonds. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked. "Now we live," Thomas said. "We live fully, we live justly. We live with compassion for those who have less and courage to stand against those who would abuse their power. We live as my father would have wanted. We live as the people we have chosen to become." Eleanor leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "I never knew I could be this happy. Before you, I had forgotten what happiness felt like. And I had forgotten what it meant to hope. But we found each other, Eleanor. Against all odds, despite all obstacles, we found each other." Thomas pressed his lips to her hair. "And I will never let you go." 1 year later, Eleanor gave birth to a son. They named him Richard, after Thomas's father, the grandfather who had died before his time, but whose legacy would live on in the child he would never know. And in the gardens of Thornhaven Castle, the roses bloomed more beautifully than ever, tended now not by a servant hiding his true nature, but by a lord who had learned that the greatest nobility lies not in titles or wealth, but in the courage to love when love seems impossible, to hope when hope seems lost, and to believe that even the darkest night must eventually give way to dawn. If you watched this far, it is because this story touched something within you. Leave a comment below saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who truly appreciates stories of love, resilience, and redemption. If this tale of courage moved you, if you felt your heart race when Thomas rode in on that white horse and silence fell across the great hall, then please give this video a like. Your support helps bring more stories like this one to life. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, that patience is rewarded, that love conquers prejudice, that our past does not define our future, share this video with them. Share the story of the gardener who became a lord, and the Baroness who learned that true nobility is measured not by birth, but by the choices we make. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Every week, we bring you stories of human resilience, unexpected love, and the quiet heroism of ordinary people who dare to dream extraordinary dreams. Subscribe now, because the next story might be the one that changes everything. Until we meet again, in the gardens of imagination.